I was 29 years old when I left Africa for America. And at the time, I genuinely believed I was making the most intelligent decision of my life. Looking back now, at 49, standing in the storage room of a grocery warehouse in Boston, with my knees aching and my hands rough from years of manual labor, I understand that intelligence and wisdom are not the same thing.
Intelligence helped me become a doctor. Wisdom might have kept me home. Back then, though, my life looked almost impossibly successful from the outside. I had completed medical school at one of the top universities in my country and later specialized in internal medicine. By 29, I was already serving as medical director of a prestigious international private hospital in my country that catered to politicians, expatriates, diplomats, oil executives, and wealthy business families. The hospital partnered with foreign medical organizations in Europe and the Gulf. We had imported diagnostic equipment, modern operating theaters, private suites with polished marble floors, and international accreditation standards that we advertised proudly. People respected me everywhere I went. Nurses stood when I entered rooms. Junior doctors lowered their voices around me. Patients requested consultations specifically with me. I wore tailored suits beneath my white coat and drove a silver Mercedes-Benz that still smelled new. Hospital board members invited me to private dinners. Pharmaceutical representatives flew me to conferences in Nairobi, Dubai, and London. My wife, Amale, was a senior financial analyst for an international investment bank with operations across Africa. Brilliant woman, sharp-minded, elegant, disciplined. She understood global markets better than most men twice her age. Sometimes at dinner parties, I would sit quietly listening to her explain investment flows and currency risks while entire tables listened carefully. We were one of those couples people pointed at admiringly. Young, educated, professional, successful. We had twin daughters, Zara and Zamudi, both 4 years old when I left for America. Every morning, they climbed onto my chest before work while shouting, "Daddy, wake up!" I can still hear their voices perfectly. We lived in a gated estate with security guards, manicured lawns, and backup generators powerful enough that we barely noticed electricity outages affecting the rest of the city. Our weekends were full of weddings, family gatherings, church events, and dinners with other professionals. At 30, I expected my life to keep rising. That was the assumption. Then, slowly, subtly, dissatisfaction entered me. Not because I was suffering, because ambition has no natural stopping point. Several colleagues had relocated abroad successfully. One worked in Canada, another moved to the United Kingdom. A former classmate in the United States kept telling me that with my credentials and experience, I could eventually establish myself internationally. "You are wasting your potential staying local," he told me during one phone call. That sentence stayed in my head. Wasting your potential. I began imagining possibilities obsessively. American specialization, higher income, international recognition, a future for my daughters. The plan sounded temporary and strategic. I would travel first to Boston on a visitor visa, take licensing exams, network aggressively, secure residency placement or sponsorship somehow, then bring my family legally afterward once stable. Even now, 20 years later, I can still remember the confidence with which I explained the plan to relatives. It may take 1 or 2 years, I told them. 1 or 2 years. God. The night before my departure, my wife sat beside me on our balcony after the children slept. The city hummed below us. Distant traffic, generators, music somewhere in the darkness. "You'll come back for us soon," she said quietly. "Of course," I replied immediately. At that moment, I believed it absolutely. I arrived in Boston in November 2005, carrying 2 suitcases, medical certificates, recommendation letters, and enough confidence to survive several lifetimes. I truly believed America would recognize merit. That was my first major misunderstanding. The cold shocked me immediately. Not just temperature, emotional coldness too. Back home, even strangers interacted warmly. In Boston, people moved quickly with headphones on, eyes forward, isolated inside themselves. Still, during the first months, I remained optimistic. I rented a room from a Ghanaian immigrant in Roxbury and spent every day researching medical licensing pathways. Very quickly, I encountered reality. To practice medicine in America, I needed licensing exams, certifications, residency placement, massive fees, years of additional training, and immigration stability I did not possess. Every process required money, time, status. I still believed I could overcome it. I studied constantly at libraries while applying for every medically related position imaginable. Clinical assistant, research coordinator, healthcare administration, medical support roles. Nothing meaningful materialized. Employers glanced at my experience respectfully but cautiously. "You have an impressive background," they said repeatedly. Then came the questions. "Are you authorized to work? Do you have U.S. clinical experience? What is your immigration status?" I watched doors close one after another. Months passed. Savings disappeared. Rent consumed money. Transportation consumed money. Winter clothing consumed money. Food consumed money. I stopped telling my wife how worried I actually felt because I needed to sound hopeful for both of us. "We are getting close," I lied often. Then my visa expiration approached. I remember the exact week panic truly entered my body. I stopped sleeping properly. My chest felt permanently tight. Every calculation ended badly. If I returned home too quickly, it would feel like failure. If I stayed longer, maybe something would happen. That word, maybe, destroyed my life. Maybe one opportunity. Maybe one connection. Maybe one breakthrough. So, I overstayed. The decision itself felt strangely undramatic. No alarms, no dramatic moment. I simply remained. That single act quietly transformed me from international physician into undocumented immigrant. At first, I worked overnight cleaning offices through another African man who managed janitorial contracts. He paid cash weekly. I told myself it was temporary while I prepared for exams. The first night I emptied trash bins inside a medical office building, humiliation hit me physically. I remember standing inside a brightly lit hallway wearing cheap cleaning gloves while staring at framed medical degrees hanging on walls. American doctors, American licenses, American careers. I had once supervised physicians. Now I cleaned after them. I kept telling myself it was temporary. Temporary became years. Eventually, survival consumed everything else.
Exam preparation faded because exhaustion replaced discipline. After cleaning overnight, my body barely functioned. I took additional jobs delivering restaurant supplies, stocking warehouse inventory, moving furniture, assisting construction crews. Cash jobs. Always cash jobs. No legal protections, no benefits, no future. I became part of America's invisible labor force. Educated immigrants hiding inside physical work beneath their qualifications. The psychological destruction happened gradually. At first, I still introduced myself mentally as a doctor. Then, eventually, I became embarrassed even thinking the word because my actual life contradicted it completely. Once, during a warehouse shift, another worker injured his arm badly while unloading equipment. Blood covered his sleeve. Instinct took over immediately. I stabilized him, improvised compression, checked circulation, instructed others calmly. Everyone stared at me afterward. "How do you know all this?" one worker asked. For a second, I almost answered proudly. Instead, I simply said, "I studied medicine long ago. Long ago. As though it belonged to another man." Meanwhile, my family remained in Africa, waiting for progress that never arrived. The first years, my daughters still saw me as a heroic figure abroad, building their future. We spoke constantly through video calls. "Daddy, when are we coming to America?" "Soon," I always answered. Soon became another lie that aged with me. My wife carried unbearable burdens alone, while still working demanding finance hours and raising twins mostly without me. Over time, frustration entered her voice despite efforts to hide it. "You said this would take 2 years." "I know. What exactly is the plan now?" "I'm trying. Trying. That word sounds pathetic after enough time passes. As years stretched forward, our marriage changed shape entirely. We became emotionally suspended between countries and expectations. Visits home became impossible because overstaying triggered devastating immigration consequences. So I remained trapped physically and psychologically. My daughters became teenagers through screens. I missed school performances, birthdays, graduations, illnesses, ordinary breakfasts, ordinary evenings. That is the real tragedy of long, undocumented life. Not only poverty, absence. You disappear from your own family's daily existence while convincing yourself sacrifice will eventually make sense. But eventually, the sacrifice itself becomes the entire story. By my 40s, my body was damaged from labor. Years of warehouse lifting destroyed my lower back. Winter cold settled permanently into my joints. I developed hypertension, partly from stress. Though ironically, I rarely accessed healthcare myself because uninsured medical costs terrified me. Sometimes I rode buses through Boston early in the morning, watching young medical students entering hospitals with backpacks and coffee cups. I would stare at them painfully. That could have been my life, here, legally. Perhaps residency, perhaps specialization, perhaps research. But undocumented existence suffocates long-term planning because survival dominates every day. One afternoon, around my 46th birthday, I walked past a hospital downtown where doctors in white coats moved confidently through revolving doors. An ambulance arrived outside. Staff rushed efficiently towards emergency intake. The smell hit me suddenly through opened doors. Hospital disinfectant. Instantly, memories flooded me so powerfully I had to stop walking. Conference rooms, patient consultations, morning rounds, my office, nurses greeting me. The authority, the purpose. I realized then that I missed not only income or status. I missed being useful in the way I was trained to be useful. That realization crushed me more deeply than poverty ever did. My wife eventually stopped waiting emotionally. Not dramatically, not through screaming, just erosion. Years separated us until intimacy became memory instead of reality. Another man eventually entered her life. By then, I almost understood before she admitted it. How long can someone remain married to a ghost in another country? I cannot even blame her honestly. My daughters became women while I remained frozen in survival mode abroad. The deepest shame came whenever relatives back home praised me publicly. America doctor. People assumed I must secretly be wealthy because I lived in the United States. Sometimes relatives asked for financial help I genuinely could not provide. They imagined success while I stocked frozen foods overnight for cash. I lied constantly out of humiliation. Not dramatic lies, just edited truths. Things are complicated. I am transitioning. Medical licensing takes time. In reality, time itself had defeated me. By 49, 20 years after arriving, I lived in a small shared apartment with 2 other immigrants outside Boston. My medical degree sat inside a plastic storage container beneath old clothes and tax papers.
Sometimes late at night, I opened the folder containing my certificates.
Doctor of Medicine, Leadership Commendations, Conference Invitations. Proof that another version of me once existed. The cruelest part is understanding that I did not lose everything at once. I surrendered it gradually, through hope. Every year, I believed next year would justify the previous sacrifices. Instead, the sacrifices multiplied until they consumed my entire adult life. One evening, my daughter Zara called me after finishing graduate school. "Dad," she asked gently, "if you could go back to 2005, would you still leave?" I could not answer immediately because honesty required admitting something unbearable. Coming to America did not merely delay my life, it replaced it. And somewhere between airport optimism and warehouse exhaustion, I stopped being the man who boarded that plane believing the world was opening for him. Zara's question stayed with me long after the call ended. That night, after my roommates fell asleep, I sat alone in the kitchen beside the refrigerator's constant humming and stared out the window at dirty snow piled along the street. Boston winters no longer looked beautiful to me. After enough years of exhaustion, winter becomes something you endure rather than admire. I finally answered her question 2 days later. No, I told her quietly over the phone. I would not leave again. Silence filled the line. Not angry silence, not shocked silence. The silence of a daughter hearing her father finally tell the truth. For years, my children had listened to me speak like a man permanently preparing for a better future. Everything was always temporary. Every humiliation had an explanation attached to it. Every sacrifice supposedly led somewhere. But by then, they were adults. They could see reality clearly. America had not elevated me. It had suspended me. The hardest part to explain to people is that undocumented life does not usually collapse all at once. It erodes slowly. You wake up one day and realize you have spent 15 years postponing your actual existence. At first, I believed I was sacrificing comfort for opportunity. Then, eventually, I realized I had sacrificed stability for uncertainty, respect for invisibility, purpose for survival. And survival by itself becomes addictive. You begin accepting conditions you once considered impossible because your entire psychology narrows around endurance. You stop asking whether life is meaningful and focus only on whether rent is covered, whether immigration officers are nearby, whether your employer will still call tomorrow. That shrinking of ambition is difficult to describe unless you have lived it. Back home, I once discussed healthcare policy with ministers and hospital executives. In Boston, I spent years anxiously checking whether warehouse supervisors would give me enough shifts to pay my share of utilities. The human mind adapts to almost anything. That is both its strength and its tragedy. My marriage finally ended quietly during my 47th year.
Amahle called one Sunday afternoon while I was walking back from a warehouse shift. I remember snow melting into grey slush along the sidewalks. I was carrying discounted groceries inside a torn reusable bag. Her voice sounded calm in a way that frightened me immediately. "There's someone I need to tell you about," she said. I already knew. Not specifically, but emotionally. I had sensed her detaching for years. Our conversations had become administrative instead of intimate. We discussed tuition, relatives, bills, the girl's progress, health updates. We no longer discussed dreams because dreams require a shared future. She told me she had met a widowed architect through mutual friends in Johannesburg after relocating there for work several years earlier. He was patient with her, present, stable, available physically and emotionally in ways I had not been for nearly 2 decades. "I waited for you for a very long time," she said softly. I leaned against a brick building and closed my eyes. There are moments when pain arrives without drama. No shouting, no collapse. Just a deep internal recognition that something has ended permanently. "I know," I answered. And I did know. People like to imagine betrayal as sudden. But abandonment can happen unintentionally through absence. I had abandoned my family little by little while convincing myself I was doing the opposite. Not because I stopped loving them, because I kept choosing the possibility of future success over the reality of present relationships. That distinction matters. A year later, she remarried quietly. My daughters attended the wedding. They told me afterward that he was a good man. That sentence wounded me more deeply than if they had hated him. Because I did not want my children harmed by my mistakes. And because some part of me understood they deserved a stable father figure after spending most of their lives watching me exist through screens and broken promises. The night of her wedding, I worked a double shift unloading frozen meat deliveries at a distribution warehouse outside Boston. At 3 a.m. during lunch break, I sat alone on an overturned crate, eating rice from a plastic container while snow fell outside the loading dock. I remember thinking, this is the life I protected all these years. Not medicine, not leadership, not family, not dignity. Just continuation. That realization nearly broke me. For several months afterward, I moved through life mechanically. Walk, sleep, bus rides, cash payments, repeated routines. My lower back pain worsened. My blood pressure medication ran out because I could not afford another clinic visit immediately. One morning, while stocking inventory, I suddenly became dizzy and had to sit down behind pallets until the room stopped spinning. A younger Haitian worker looked at me carefully. "You okay, old man?" Old man. The phrase shocked me because inside myself, I still carried memories of the ambitious doctor boarding a plane at the airport back home in 2005
believing America would expand his destiny. But time does not care about self-image. I was aging inside warehouses while my actual profession existed only in memory. Around that period, African immigrants much younger than me began seeking my advice. Friends of friends, new arrivals, students, young professionals frustrated with opportunities back home. Many spoke exactly the way I once spoke. There's no future here. America has more opportunities. I'll struggle for a few years, then stabilize. Once I get there, everything changes. Whenever I heard those sentences, I felt something heavy inside my chest. Because I recognized the dangerous combination of ambition and illusion. One young Nigerian doctor met me for coffee after hearing about my background through a mutual acquaintance. He had received an opportunity to travel to America using a temporary visa and wanted guidance. He expected encouragement. Instead, I spoke more honestly than I ever had before. America is not magic, I told him, and immigration instability destroys professional momentum faster than you understand. He looked surprised. I continued. If you come legally, with a clear pathway, resources, sponsorship, and realistic expectations, fine. But do not throw away a meaningful life because you imagine America automatically converts sacrifice into success. He argued immediately. But people make it. Yes, I said. Some do. But you only hear from survivors. You rarely hear from people like us because shame silences failure. That conversation lasted almost 3 hours. It appeared that he still wasn't convinced. He imagined something else. Maybe his mind was made up. I told him things nobody told me at 29. That professional identity is fragile. That starting over at 30 is different from starting over at 22. That undocumented existence traps educated people inside survival cycles that consume years rapidly. That loneliness changes personality. That separation damages marriages even when love exists. That ambition without strategy becomes self-destruction. Most importantly, I told him something I wish someone had forced me to understand years earlier. A good life does not become worthless simply because it exists in Africa. That sentence alone could have saved me. There is a particular sickness among many educated Africans, especially ambitious professionals, where we begin viewing our own countries only through deficiency. We compare everything upward toward Western standards until we become blind to what we already possess. I had status, purpose, community, family presence, professional respect, identity. I traded all of it for hypothetical future prestige. And the tragedy is that I was not escaping poverty or war or persecution. I was escaping dissatisfaction. That is a dangerous reason to gamble your life. Now, at 49, I still wake before dawn most mornings. I still take buses across Boston in heavy boots during winter. I still live carefully, quietly, invisibly. Undocumented life trains you to avoid attention. I no longer speak about next year the way I once did. Age removes certain illusions naturally. Some nights, I still open the plastic container holding my old certificates. The papers smell faintly stale now, ink fading slightly at the edges. Doctor, medical director, conference speaker, artifacts from another lifetime. But lately, I have stopped looking at them with pure grief. Instead, I look at them as evidence of something important. I was not foolish because I lacked intelligence. I was foolish because I believed success always exists somewhere else. If any young African professional ever hears my story, this is what I want them to understand. Do not let social media, migration fantasies, or global inequality convince you that your current life has no value simply because it exists outside Europe or America. Do not abandon stable careers blindly chasing symbolic prestige abroad. Do not confuse movement with progress. And never assume that sacrifice automatically becomes meaningful simply because it is painful. Sometimes people destroy beautiful lives while trying to upgrade them. That is what happened to me. I left Africa believing I was expanding my future. Instead, little by little, year after year, I disappeared from my own life. The closest I came to dying happened on a Tuesday morning in February. Boston was buried under dirty ice that week. The warehouse loading docks were freezing because one of the doors kept malfunctioning and refusing to close fully. We were unloading imported frozen chicken from a delivery truck when a sharp pain suddenly exploded across the center of my chest. Not dramatic like in movies. No collapsing instantly. Just pressure. Heavy. Crushing. At first, I kept walking. That is another thing prolonged struggle does to people. You normalize suffering because stopping feels financially dangerous. I remember gripping a pallet jack while sweat formed beneath my winter jacket despite the cold air. My left arm tingled, my breathing shortened. One of the younger workers looked at me carefully. "You good?" I nodded automatically. Then the dizziness came. I sat down on stacked boxes, pretending I merely needed rest, but internally I knew exactly what was happening. 20 years earlier, I had diagnosed patients describing identical symptoms. Possible myocardial infarction, stress-induced cardiac event, hypertensive complications. Even in that moment, part of my mind observed the irony clinically. The undocumented warehouse laborer diagnosing his own heart attack beside frozen poultry. Someone eventually called an ambulance despite my protests. At the emergency room, everything felt surreal. Bright lights, monitors beeping, nurses moving quickly, doctors asking questions. For the first time in decades, I was back inside medicine, not as worker or janitor or invisible laborer, but as patient. A young resident physician entered my room later that evening, Asian American, probably early 30s, intelligent eyes behind rectangular glasses. He reviewed my chart while speaking casually.
"So, what do you do for work?"
"Warehouse," I answered.
Then he noticed something in my file. "You studied medicine?"
I hesitated.
"Yes, long ago." He looked up immediately. "Where?" I told him. "What specialty?" "Internal medicine." For several seconds, he simply stared at me. I could see him trying to reconcile the information with the exhausted immigrant lying before him in hospital socks and discounted sweatpants.
"You were a physician?"
The word struck me unexpectedly. Were. Past tense. "Yes," I answered quietly. That conversation unsettled me for days afterward. Not because he judged me, because he did not. His expression held something worse. Sadness. The sadness people reserve for ruined potential.
After discharge, hospital billing statements began arriving almost immediately. Thousands of dollars, numbers completely disconnected from my financial reality. I added them to the growing pile of unopened envelopes beside my bed. Debt stopped frightening me years earlier because survival had already consumed my dignity long before creditors arrived. A few months later, Zara came to America for the first time. Not to immigrate, not to reunite permanently. She attended an academic conference in New York connected to her graduate research and took a bus to Boston afterward. The last time I had physically held my daughter, she had still been small enough to sleep on my chest. Now she was 24 years old. When I saw her standing outside South Station, wearing a long camel-colored coat and holding a coffee cup, something inside me fractured emotionally. Because she looked like an adult stranger, carrying my daughter's face. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. Then she hugged me tightly, and I realized immediately how much physical affection video calls cannot replace. I had missed the ordinary evolution of fatherhood, the gradual transitions, the daily presence, the accumulated years that allow parents and children to grow alongside each other naturally. Instead, I experienced my daughters in emotional snapshots, separated by continents and time zones. We spent 3 days together in Boston. I tried hiding the harshest parts of my life, but children eventually see truth, even when parents edit it carefully. She noticed my limp, the exhaustion in my posture, how slowly I climbed apartment stairs, how small my room was. One evening, she quietly opened my refrigerator and stared at its contents for several seconds. Eggs, rice, cheap juice, frozen vegetables, medication. That was all. I saw her eyes change slightly. Not judgment, grief. That hurt more. The second night, we sat beside the Charles River, watching reflections move across dark water while cold wind swept between buildings downtown. "You know," she said carefully, "when we were younger,
Zamodi and I imagined your life completely differently. I laughed softly. So did I. She smiled sadly. No, I mean, we thought America made you important. I looked toward the city skyline. The strange thing is that America had once made me feel important simply by proximity. Back home, saying you lived in the United States automatically elevated perception, regardless of actual reality.
People confuse geography with achievement all the time. What do you think now? I asked. She took time answering. I think you were already important before you left. That sentence nearly destroyed me, because buried inside it was the realization that my daughters had not needed American prestige. They had needed their father. The morning she returned to New York, we stood outside the bus terminal, awkwardly delaying goodbye. Then suddenly, she hugged me again and whispered something into my ear. Come home. 3 simple words. Come home. I wish I could describe how painful those words felt after 20 years undocumented. Home had transformed psychologically into something distant and almost mythical. I had spent so long trapped between countries that neither place fully belonged to me anymore. America never truly accepted me. But absence had also changed my relationship to Africa. I no longer knew where I fit. For weeks after Zara left, I thought constantly about her words. Come home. At first, I dismissed the idea immediately. How would I survive? What would people say? How could I return visibly diminished after 2 decades abroad? Pride is expensive. Mine had already cost me 20 years. Then one evening, I received news that an older physician I once trained under back home had died unexpectedly. Professor Amugonibu, brilliant cardiologist, mentor, severe but kind beneath the surface. I sat alone in my room staring at the message for a very long time. And suddenly, a horrifying realization entered me. My entire generation was aging. Parents dying, mentors disappearing, friends becoming old. Meanwhile, I remained emotionally frozen inside a failed migration story that had already consumed half my life. That night, I opened the plastic storage container holding my certificates for what would become the final time in Boston. I spread everything across my bed carefully. Medical degree, recommendation letters, conference badges, photographs from hospital events. In one picture, Amahe stood beside me smiling in an emerald green dress while I held one of the girls as a baby. I stared at that photograph for nearly an hour. Not because I wanted my old life back exactly. That life no longer existed. But because I finally understood something clearly after years of denial. There are mistakes you cannot reverse. Only endings you can choose with honesty. 2 months later, I bought a one-way ticket home. Not triumphantly, not optimistically, quietly. I sold most of my belongings or gave them away. Winter jackets, old boots, kitchen supplies, cheap furniture accumulated across 20 transient years. My roommates seemed shocked. You sure? One asked repeatedly. No, I was not sure. But certainty had already ruined enough of my life. The morning of my departure, I stood alone outside Logan Airport, watching planes rise into grey clouds over Boston Harbor. The same airport where I had arrived 20 years earlier, believing the world was opening for me. I thought about that younger version of myself constantly during check-in. Ambitious, restless, certain bigger geography automatically meant bigger destiny. I did not hate him. That younger man was not evil or stupid, just arrogant enough to underestimate how fragile a life can become once disconnected from belonging, legality, profession, and family simultaneously. During the flight, I barely slept. Somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, I realized I was terrified, not of failure anymore, but visibility. In America, I had become invisible. Back home, people would see me completely. The returned immigrant, the failed success story, the doctor who vanished abroad for 20 years and came back with damaged knees, high blood pressure, and no real wealth. But strangely, beneath the fear, another emotion slowly appeared. Relief. Because for the first time in decades, I was no longer postponing my life waiting for next year. Whatever remained of my future would at least happen honestly. When the plane landed at the airport, heat struck me immediately after leaving the airport. Dense, humid, alive. And for the first time in 20 years, I heard people around me laughing loudly, the way Africans laugh without restraint in public spaces. Not rushed, not guarded. Alive. My daughters met me outside arrivals. I am home. Older now. Professional women. Beautiful. Confident. For several seconds, we simply stared at each other, emotionally overwhelmed by the fact that no screen separated us anymore. Then Samodi began crying first. After that, all three of us did. Not dramatic crying. The kind produced by accumulated years finally reaching the surface at once. As they hugged me, one realization repeated quietly inside my mind. I came to America searching for a bigger life. And after losing almost everything, I finally understood that a meaningful life is usually built from ordinary presence, not distant ambition. Not prestige, not foreign validation, not symbolic success. Presence. That was the thing I traded away. And the thing I understood too late was priceless.